Hello again. In our first screencast that goes along with the Cornell notes on pages 9 and 10 of your Renaissance packet, we talked about the sources of demand for art during the Renaissance period and focused on the new media and techniques that were used in creating Renaissance painting. In this second screencast, we're going to look at advances in sculpting and printmaking, and we'll finish up by looking at some themes that you can look for when you examine Renaissance art more closely. The word Renaissance actually means rebirth, as you might remember, and it started with the rebirth of Greek and Roman culture and ideas. And there's no better example of that than in sculpting. Sculptors in the Renaissance usually worked in one of two mediums. They either cast figures in bronze or they carved them out of marble. In the case of casting bronze, the system actually worked pretty much the same way it had during the Greek and Roman times. You started with a wood frame, fashioned the model around it in clay, coated the clay model with wax, and then formed a second layer of clay as a mold around the outside. Heating the mold to harden it melted the wax which drained out, leaving space for molten metal to form around the clay figure, and thus, when the outside mold was broken, created a completed bronze sculpture with a separate shield and sword added for a little bit of pizzazz. This was pretty much the standard method of casting bronze. What the Renaissance artists did to add on to it was to create the notion of reusable molds and reusable casts, as you can see along the top layer here. By casting different parts and pieces, it allowed you to either create multiples of the same work or create variations on the same work. Often the pieces were finally assembled by using what amounts to an injection molding model. You would see this in the making of plastic things like model kits or the plastic forks you might use at a picnic. Some great examples of bronze castings are Donatello's version of the biblical story of David, shown here in bronze, standing about 5'2". The next generation saw Andrea Del Verrocchio. You might remember him as the creator of the Lorenzo de' Medici bust we saw in the last screencast. This is Verrocchio's own take on David. And then he also cast this massive sculpture of Bartolomeo Colleoni. So this should give you a good idea of what artists were capable of and how rich the detail could be in casting of bronze. As we said, those artists who didn't work in bronze often carved in marble, literally taking a piece of stone, a hammer, and a chisel to knock away the extra stone that wasn't part of your product, and then using rasps and files to scrape it down and in effect buff it up until it looked like a living person, a living being. Marble was the choice of sculptors, one, because of its appearance, and two, because as stones go, it's fairly soft, put that in quotations, and easy to work with. Here are three examples of Renaissance sculpture featuring the biblical story of David. For those of you who have forgotten or aren't familiar with it, David was a Hebrew shepherd whose story was told in the Old Testament. The Hebrews were at war with a tribe called the Philistines. The Philistines offered to have a one-on-one battle to settle the whole dispute and sent out a 9-foot giant by the name of Goliath. None of the Hebrew soldiers wanted to fight Goliath, so David, the young shepherd boy, stepped up. Armed with no armor, just a sling and a stone, David takes out Goliath with a shot between the eyes and then cuts off Goliath's head and stands in victory. The story of David was very popular during the Renaissance as it represented two ideas that Renaissance people valued very much: faith in God and also the humanist faith in yourself. What's interesting about these three works is that They all show different phases of the story. Michelangelo's massive 14-foot sculpture of David in the center shows David before the battle, stone in one hand, sling over his shoulder, looking across the field at his opponent. He is ready to meet the challenge. Bernini Sculpture of 1624, late Renaissance, is full of drama. Here David has just thrown the stone. You see the sling behind him, and he's looking as the stone flies towards Goliath. And ironically, the earliest of these statues, Donatello's bronze casting of David, shows the young shepherd boy, who by the way is wearing the hairstyle and hat of a 1440 shepherd, standing in victory over the severed head of his rival. Three different versions of the same story, all cast in beautiful, lifelike art, whether cast or carved. Before we move on to printing, let's take a look at these two unfinished works here. These are also sculptures by Michelangelo. It was said of the great master that he could see exactly what the finished statue was going to look like, and that for him the process was simply a matter of carving away everything that wasn't part of his finished product. It's an interesting way of looking at the work. This is also a good example of showing how detailed Michelangelo was in depicting the human body and the human anatomy. It's here we should point out that artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci learned as much as they did by the dissection of cadavers. Yes, that's dead bodies. But just as you'd take apart a watch to see how it works, they did the same thing with humans, with incredibly lifelike results, whether painting, as Da Vinci, or sculpting, as Michelangelo. Printmakers also developed during the Renaissance. Printmaking allowed artists, just as with the bronze casting, to repeat multiple copies of the same work or do variations on the same work. Printing in the Renaissance for artistic purposes took on two forms. The most prominent, and the one most remember, is copper etching. You started with a copper plate, shown here, a smooth polished copper plate. You would then lay on a light coating of wax onto that plate. Then, taking a stylus or a point, you would carve or etch your design, your image, into the wax plate, the wax and copper plate rather. Finally, you'd subject the plate and wax to a chemical bath, more often than not with different forms of acid. The result created an etched copper plate that could then be pressed into an ink pad, pressed onto paper, creating the print that you see here from the copper plate shown here. Just keep in mind too that artists often had to work in terms of mirror images. If you want the bird to look this way, you've got to have your plate pointing that way to make the print work. Think about the stamps that you might have used as you were younger. This is another good example of an etching and the copper plate and the print you could get as a result. The subject is the Dutch artist Rembrandt. You might remember him as knowing chiaroscuro, but he was also famous for his etchings, which were often beautifully detailed, such as this one, which is called The Three Trees. Notice that by processing the lines and by processing the work through different forms of chemicals and taking the same plate and applying it to different kinds of paper, you could get many different kinds of effects from your printing, from simple line work to deep detail and shadows. Pretty impressive stuff. Woodcut printing, not as elaborate as copper etching, but still very effective, was simply the carving of designs into a wood block. In this case, the German artist Albrecht Durer created a vision of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. These are the dudes that show up on Judgment Day looking to find out if you made the cut or not. The detail is phenomenal, and it's a hallmark of Northern Renaissance work, as you'll find out when you dig deeper into some of the Renaissance work on the checklist in your packet. Finally, let's look at some Renaissance themes. This first work, Hercules defeating the Centaur, actually represents two themes. Humanism was a major theme in the Renaissance. Renaissance thinkers, like the Greeks and Romans before them, thought humans were unique. They were special and they had incredible value and abilities. Hercules defeating the Centaur represents the strength, courage, and bravery of humanity, and it also incorporates a second theme, that of classical thinking or classicism. In this case, Hercules, a Greek hero, is being held up as a model of culture by the Renaissance thinkers of 2,000 years later. Next to humanism and classicism, the most dominant theme of Renaissance artwork was religion. No surprise, because the church was paying for a lot of the artwork that was produced, such as this statue of Jesus being taken down from the cross and to his tomb, a tomb lent him by Nicodemus, shown here in this statue in a Michelangelo self-portrait. Religion was still a very powerful force in people's lives, as the amount of art you'll see will indicate to you. Some other themes included individualism. Just as Castiglione wrote the Book of the Courtier, people were interested in how to improve themselves, and they were interested in the uniqueness of humans. Castiglione's portrait here, by the way, is produced by the artist Raphael. Pretty neat to get a Raphael to paint your portrait. Individualism, because it wasn't necessarily religious in nature, was considered secular. The word secular applies to any aspect of life that doesn't directly involve religion, whether it's everyday social life, political, or economic life, such as might have been lived by a Lorenzo de' Medici, seen here in the Verrocchio sculpture. Lorenzo de' Medici, like many of the bourgeoisie, was also very rich, and this idea of physical wealth, physical possessions, was also very important to many Renaissance people, particularly the nobles and the bourgeoisie. So materialism becomes yet another theme. Our final theme here is going to be realism. Just as Machiavelli wrote about politics in a real sense, not the way it should be, but the way it is, artists were often very interested in showing things visually and physically the way they actually were. Think back to our first screencast in the painting of the grandfather and grandson, where the grandfather is shown literally warts and all. In another sense, Renaissance artists look for realism by painting the world as they saw it, not necessarily as they wanted it to be. Artists like Rembrandt and Peter Bruegel were interested in showing not just the life of the nobility, not just the world of the haves, but also the world of the don't have as muches and even the have-nots. That's another theme that you might want to explore in your search through Renaissance art. Hopefully we've given you some ideas for how to look at art and some ideas and themes to look for. Good luck on your hunt, and we'll see you again soon.